So we're continuing our conversation about intelligence analysis skills, about forming judgments, forecasting, and analysis about the world. And I want to introduce a technique that is used by the U.S. intelligence community called analysis of competing hypotheses. And this is one of a set of what are called structured analytic techniques, or SATs, that have been developed to help human beings sort of overcome or work around some of the biases in decision making and judgment that we face. And just to kind of give you a sense of why this one's important, a number of years ago, I was at a sort of an academic convention hosted by the Director of National Intelligence, and they brought in the folks who were responsible for the judgment and lead up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq about whether or not Saddam Hussein was developing and hiding weapons of mass destruction. And the analyst sort of at the table was sort of talking about how there was a moment, late one night, they'd ordered pizza, they were sitting around, and someone threw out the idea that, wow, what if he has nothing? What if there's no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we're just sort of, chasing our tail looking for these weapons and finding confirming evidence, but what if there's nothing there? And what he's really saying is we didn't use the technique that we were trained in, which is analysis of competing hypotheses. And this is a method that allows for us to put forward multiple possible outcomes or possible judgments simultaneously and scrutinize them against the evidence. And that doing that is going to produce a better judgment than just simply picking what we think is likely the case and looking for confirming evidence that proves that we're right. That sort of feeds into a lot of the biases and the preconceptions that we already have, and doesn't really tell us whether or not our conclusion has more evidence or less evidence for it compared to some other possibility. And so I'd like to talk through how the analysis of competing hypotheses idea works and give you a sense of how it could be deployed. So the first step in analysis of competing hypotheses is to develop the hypotheses, right? That's plural. And so an effective analysis will involve all of the possible explanations for a question or a problem. Right. And so if we're thinking about Saddam Hussein in 2003 and whether or not he has weapons of mass destruction, we could think about, yes, he does, and they're deployed. We could have, yes, he does, and they're hidden or stored somewhere else, like in Syria. We could say, no, he doesn't. We could say, no, he doesn't, but lots of people think he does, even within his own government. Right, or he's been trying to cultivate the illusion that he does, even though he's already gotten rid of all of his material. So you want to kind of develop hypotheses that cover the full range of what could be going on. Obviously, we don't go to sort of the extreme of, magical beings like Merlin are responsible for particular things, or Merlin's hiding weapons of mass destruction for Saddam Hussein, within the realm of possibility. But it's maybe useful to draw out sort of a logic tree of what are the various different possibilities to generate hypotheses that cover the full range. And so that a wide range of hypotheses that will all be considered simultaneously is central to this analysis of competing hypotheses method. Second, we generate a matrix. And so each of our hypotheses is given a column, and we're going to populate the matrix with rows listing all of the significant evidence for or against the hypotheses. So every piece of information that we have that's potentially relevant is going to get a row in our matrix. And so there's a temptation to focus on the things that we sort of see in front of us, that we have sort of in our hands. But the analysis of competing hypotheses method would maybe encourage us to also think about what are the things that would confirm these hypotheses or disconfirm these hypotheses, and we don't have. Right? So not just the documents that we have that are sort of concrete evidence, what are we missing? And we can be missing things because we weren't able to get it, or we could be missing things because it doesn't exist. And depending upon how we come down on, yeah, that information's out there, but there's no way for us to get it, versus that evidence doesn't exist, that might provide evidence for or against different hypotheses. And so it actually should probably be listed. We don't have a credible scientist working on the inside in Iraq that says, I'm working on chemical weapons and have been for the last 5 years. If that person doesn't exist, maybe that's a sign that US intelligence in Iraq isn't very good, or maybe it's a sign that there is no such scientist doing that sort of thing. So compile all the evidence available, both that's physical in front of you and potential. We're going to consider how each piece of evidence relates to our hypothesis, to each hypothesis. And so in the matrix, we're going to work horizontally initially. And what that means is that we're going to start with a particular piece of evidence. So in row 1, and we're going to say, how does this piece of evidence affect hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, and hypothesis 3? So we're working across the rows. And for each of those hypotheses, we're asking, is it consistent? Is it inconsistent, or ambiguous, right? Consistent doesn't mean this is sort of a slam dunk. Consistent means this piece of evidence can exist in a world where that hypothesis is true. So that a piece of evidence can be consistent with lots of different hypotheses, right? A piece of evidence could be the sun rises in the east. Is that consistent with Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction? Yes, it is. That piece of evidence can be true in that world where Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein does not have weapons of mass destruction. The sun rises in the east. Is that consistent? Yes, that can still be true in a world where Saddam Hussein does not have weapons of mass destruction. So consistent doesn't mean relevant, doesn't mean that it's providing useful evidence. It just means I can have this piece of information. I can have this document in front of me. And can that hypothesis still be true? Inconsistent, however, means, yeah, I don't see how that could square, right? I don't see how I can have this piece of evidence and that hypothesis remains true. And ambiguous is, maybe I'm not sure how to work that. Maybe I'm going to sort of set that aside and hold off on forming a judgment based on that piece of evidence right now. We can also sort of put in modifiers, right? So consistent, it might be, yeah, it's consistent, but it seems a little odd, or it doesn't seem to line up quite right. During the intelligence assessment before 2003 about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, there was a lot of attention paid to Saddam Hussein's regime trying to acquire aluminum tubes and trying to acquire chlorine gas. Well, chlorine gas has lots of uses. It can be used as a chemical weapon, but it can also be used to chlorinate water so that people don't get sick and die from drinking water. And so seeking out chlorine gas would be consistent with both a world where Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons and a world where he doesn't. In terms of the aluminum tubes, in a world where he does have an active nuclear weapons program, maybe that's evidence in favor of it. In a world where he doesn't, I mean, is it inconsistent that he would want these tubes that seem to have a use primarily for nuclear weapons? Well, it's maybe unusual, maybe it's consistent, maybe it seems slightly inconsistent. We can sort of modify and adjust with pluses or minuses or asterisks if we find a piece of evidence to be particularly strong or unclear how it should play out. So as we're going through the matrix, we're sort of filling in C's and I's and sort of starring them when we see sort of a slam dunk piece of evidence, or pluses or minuses if we kind of have to sort of squint and figure out how to make everything work. Okay, so you fill out your matrix for all of your rows and all of your hypotheses, and then we're going to rework the matrix. And what that means is that we're going to maybe refine hypotheses based on new evidence, right? So initially I had thought that maybe Saddam Hussein had hidden weapons in Syria. Now I'm not so sure because I see evidence that maybe weapons have been moved to, I don't know, offshore submarines in the Persian Gulf. I'm making this up. I have no idea that that's a thing, but maybe I got sort of hints that my initial hypothesis of hidden somewhere outside of Iraq's borders actually has value, just not the way I had initially framed it, right? So we're allowed to sort of go back and adjust as we sort of have the full picture of evidence. Also, as we're going through this analysis, additional evidence might come to light. We might go and dig and find additional stuff. We should be able to add that in. And then lastly, we're going to delete or hide any evidence that's consistent with all hypotheses. And I think this is a really useful and important step in this process. And so if we go back to that example of the sun rises in the east, is that consistent with the world where Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons? It is. Is it consistent with the world where he doesn't? It is. Because it's consistent across both of those hypotheses, it doesn't really help us to adjudicate whether one is more correct than the other. Likewise, Saddam Hussein is seeking chlorine gas. Is consistent with the world where he's developing chlorine gas as a weapon. It's also consistent with the world where he doesn't have chemical weapons because they need to chlorinate swimming pools or drinking water, right? So because there's a plausible way that that would happen with both of those scenarios, it doesn't actually give us new useful information in terms of saying one hypothesis is more compelling than another. And so because it doesn't help us, we can actually just sort of delete that out. And one of the reasons why I think that this is important is because you can stack up lots and lots and lots of evidence behind one hypothesis and come to the conclusion that there's lots of evidence for that hypothesis. But if all of that evidence is equally plausible for all of your other hypotheses, you haven't actually stacked up anything that's useful. You've just sort of reaffirmed that you're looking at this one direction and you see many things that are consistent with that world that you've sort of imagined. So we're hiding evidence where everything is consistent. Step 4, we're going to go back and we're going to assess that evidence that we have that remains to ask, is this something that we should really be basing our judgment on? And so we're going to ask some basic questions about the reliability of the sources and the credibility of the information. And so the US intelligence field manual for the Army recommends scoring intelligence in terms of reliability and credibility, and sort of gives a A through F rating and a 1 through 6 rating, where F and 6 are I don't know. And so when we're thinking about the source, is the source somebody that we've worked with before, somebody who's provided reliable information in the past, who is in a position to really have the inside scoop and I can believe what they're saying? Maybe we give that person an A, and that piece of evidence that they're providing us gets sort of an A rating. Is it somebody who consistently gives us incorrect information, or maybe has a reason to not provide good information to us? Maybe I want to give that an E rating of unreliable. I might also want to think about the information itself. Is it something that's been confirmed by other sources, ideally other credible sources? So we've sort of triangulated in, and we've got 3 different pieces of evidence that all sort of point in the same direction. Yeah, that's reliable information, credible information. I can score that as a 1. Or am I hearing this sort of crazy story that just doesn't seem to fit with anything that I've heard before, that I find really hard to believe? Maybe I want to score that as improbable. It seems to run counter to other things that we think we know. And so going through and sort of looking at the evidence that we have in that matrix and figuring out, is this something that I should really be focusing on, or I should be taking with a grain of salt, is a useful step in this process of adjudicating between hypotheses. And then finally, we're going to evaluate each hypothesis. And for this, we're going to be working vertically. And so again, going back to our table, that means we're going to say, okay, hypothesis 1. Now I'm going to go down the column and look at how many C's for consistent and I's for inconsistent I have, and what that evidence tells me about that hypothesis. And the idea is that we are looking for disconfirming evidence. We're looking for those I's, for that inconsistency, things that help us to say this hypothesis doesn't square with what we know. And the more evidence against a hypothesis, the easier it is for us to dismiss it, right? And again, we are also looking for evidence in favor of a hypothesis, particularly if the evidence is strong. But because you can have evidence that supports multiple different hypotheses, and because we also oftentimes don't have all of the evidence that's possible to get or that might exist in the world, the analysis of competing hypothesis method sort of discourages us from saying, well, I have 50 pieces of evidence that support this hypothesis, because it may or may not be useful in privileging one hypothesis over another. And then finally, we're supposed to rank hypotheses. So the goal of this method is not to say, this is the one answer. It's to say, here's a range of possibilities that we think might be going on. Here's some that we think are very implausible, remote likelihood of happening. Here are some that we think maybe are pretty strong, but we see some inconsistencies. And here's the one or two, maybe three scenarios or options that we think have a lot of evidence behind them, and we think have very little disconfirming evidence, and therefore we think are fairly strong judgments to draw from this data. And that might be communicated in terms of sort of a probability. We judge this possibility to be very likely, might mean 80% certainty. Almost certain might be 90, 95, right? Even chance is sort of 50%. It could be this, but there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. And depending on how that plays out, it could go one way or another. Very unlikely is maybe 15, 20%, and remote is 1 to 5%, an unlikely scenario to be true. We've got a lot of disconfirming evidence in play. So the analysis competing hypotheses method is a systematic way of taking a lot of different pieces of information, applying it systematically to judge multiple different possibilities, hypotheses, and then looking for where we see evidence against hypotheses to help us to sort of reject them. And using this method can help us to avoid some of the biases that we have as information processors, and can prevent us from getting sucked into a sort of cognitive trap where we sort of identify what we think is true, and we start just looking for confirmation of what we already believe, rather than recognizing that there's other possibilities that are also confirmed by those pieces of evidence that we have.